where it's actually used as an aggregate number as part of a bidding process, where contractors get bonus points or more leeway to spend some more money or get a favorable rating in the tender award process in the evaluation of life cycle assessment results. And what they're using is they're using the abatement costs associated with the pollution that you create. And so it's where you create an impact, how much does it take to remediate or fix that problem? And so it's sort of a distance to target, and based on technology, how much it costs to clean it up. And you can do that for several impact categories out of the list that Alyssa mentioned. And if in a certain jurisdiction people agree on that's the selection of impact categories, yes, this is a way that we like to see this monetized, then you can actually add it. And the experience is that this is a DOT in the Netherlands, and that if they do this with their methodology, that the LCA costs are typically adding 10, 20, 30% in monetary value to the project cost. And so it's relevant, it's significant, and it's actually something they bring together, like I said, in the award process. So it's not perfect. Science is definitely not settled. This includes another range of uncertainty, like Alyssa said, but people are trying to answer this question because it's a good question, and so I'm glad it was being asked. In America, we haven't done anything like that as of yet, as far as I know.
And you know, what's nice about this is we actually have one of the attendees who also commented, basically saying in lieu of trying to assign dollar values to environmental benefits, comparing alternatives qualitatively or assigning relative values using a matrix usually helps the engineers. This person's probably not an engineer. But, you know, if we can put it in a table and add some kind of relative value, that might also be a value.
Yeah, I've seen examples of rankings where results from LCCA and LCA were both expressed on a scale from A, B, C, or D, or 1 through 6. And if you then do both and you put them together, you can say, okay, well, we're selecting the A or B on the economics, we're selecting the B or C on the environmental performance. That would be a more qualitative way, sort of a rating system way of dealing with this.
Yeah, if I could add to that briefly, this is Steve. I know within Green Roads, actually we try to include economic value of environmental systems in how we weighted the rating system. We spent a long time thinking about how to weight it, and it turns out there have been several efforts, and one of the more notable ones was probably about 15, 20 years ago. I think it was published in Nature. And they tried to, on a very, very gross scale, estimate what ecosystem services were worth. And they were estimating it anywhere between $16 and $54 trillion a year, with a mean of about $33 trillion. And they compared that to the world gross national product of $18 trillion. So, you know, a roughly sort of at least 2-to-1 ratio. And we kind of implemented that 2-to-1 ratio when we were looking at how we weighted certain economic credits with how we weighted certain environmental credits. So it's all built into the rating system in that particular instance, at least in a very gross way.
Good deal. We do have a question, and I really don't know who to direct it to, so I'll throw it out there, and hopefully somebody will jump onto it. Did you give enough attention to durability in your FHWA document? For instance, why didn't you make it a separate criterion parallel to economic, environmental, and social impacts?
So, Tom, I guess maybe for clarification, we're talking about this particular document here, the guidebook. If that's the case,
I believe so.
Yeah, I was going to say, if that's the case, it should show up in design.
I mean, we do talk about durability and longevity, but I guess the question, maybe the bigger question is, should it sit on the same plane as our 3 legs of the economic, environmental, and social impacts, or does longevity, you know, kind of come into play in each of those?
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, you.
Yeah, from a life cycle assessment perspective, durability relates to one element in your model, which is, well, how long are we going to have, how long are we going to enjoy the investment that we're making in a specific type of pavement. That is, between brackets, just one of the modeling parameters that gets expressed in the results liability model. And so for some assessments, durability is key. For others, less so. It's one of the parameters, and it's integrated in the overall model. And what LCA does is try to put numbers to that, how you can actually quantify that from an environmental performance perspective, just like the LCCA tries to do this from an economic performance perspective. And so there are studies, and I think one of the slides from Melissa touched on it, where LCA was used to review some of the longevity strategies. Typically, you then would have to look at everything from construction to different frequencies of maintenance and rehab to a certain point in time where you call it end of life, and compare that to other alternatives, and just make that part of your assessment. And so it's a topic that you can specifically call out and study with LCA, but I think it's part of the same assessment method, and I think the same applies to LCCA and the rating system. So maybe Steve, you can talk about that a little bit.
Sure. Yeah, I agree with what you're talking about, and it does show up in rating systems, and I think it's part of all the different categories, so it shows up in each one. And the way you'll see durability show up, and durability is usually the term that is recognized by the broadest array of people when you're talking about this quality characteristic of a system. And you'll see it show up in rating systems in construction quality, and that's actually a difficult one to address in rating systems, but you'll see it there. You'll see it in long life pavement, or if it's an infrastructure system, you'll see some sort of durability of the piece of infrastructure there. And it often shows up in maintenance and rehabilitation plan and systems and credits and points for those as well.
Great. And I have a question, Alyssa, that I'm going to ask you, and primarily because I haven't heard your voice recently. The question is basically, you know, there it went. Okay. Any comments on linkages of sustainability with asset management?
Well, I don't. I guess I have two answers for that. One is that Joop already pointed out that at least this isn't quite asset management, but in the bid process in some European countries, life cycle-based indicators are used as part of the process. And here in California, an estimate of CO2 emissions it has been integrated into the pavement management system to allow pavement managers to actually understand some of the implications of asset management decisions on CO2 emissions or greenhouse gas emissions. So that's just one environmental impact that's been integrated into the system. And I'd say that otherwise it's pretty limited. I don't think we see a very strong connection between the two.
I guess at least at this point. Did anyone else want to add to that?
This is Kurt. Yeah, Tom, that is something we do talk about in the reference document, and I think that's covered in Chapter 7 of the reference document. So we'll be hitting that a little bit later in one of the future webinar events. But I think what Alyssa's saying is, yeah, right now I don't think many state highway agencies are doing much with that, but at least I've been seeing a little bit at some of the local level. You're starting to see them trying to integrate some sustainability indicators into their pavement management and decision-making process. So I think we're starting to see some growth in that area.
Yeah, and I would agree. I think that I definitely am seeing interest, at least on the West Coast.
Yeah, and if you look at it from a green building perspective, so not a pavement perspective, these are actually key questions from large portfolio managers, real estate development companies, And the analogy would be maybe for tollway authorities to do some of the same thinking there and see what concepts are being delivered and developed in asset management and green building, and how we can incorporate those for sustainable pavement asset management as well. It'll be interesting to see how that could line up.
Great. Steve, I'm going to come back to you with a question. You know, and the question would be, isn't it just a bit overwhelming when the scope is so large? You know, how do you move forward without being lost in the woods, so to speak? And then can you give an example of success?
Yeah, that's a good question, right? We've started out by defining sustainability as roughly, I'm paraphrasing here, everything. So now what? So yeah, it does cover a lot, and how do you add structure to it and move forward and make progress and show that you're doing that? And there's some help out there. One, right? There's this guidebook. Hooray! You know, it's got background, impacts for all these different pavement life cycle stages, state of the practice in each one, numbers and calculations and tools and help and all that kind of stuff. And then, you know, I'm involved a lot in rating systems, and what we see, the way we see some of these rating systems used is they basically start as a very high-level menu of sustainability from which you can pick. And we've worked to work on that second phrase, from which you can pick, and we've done some work on, you know, how do you pick ones that you do? You know, how do you relate what you pick out of a rating system to pursue, and how does that relate to your agency's strategic direction, goals, and objectives? So for instance, one of the earlier projects we worked on with Green Roads, there was a design firm that was charged with redesigning basically Main Street that goes through a town, and the town said, hey, you know, one of our directives from the city council and from the people in the town is we want to be, you know, the most sustainable town in, you know, the state or the area or the country or whatever the case may be, and we'd like you to build us a sustainable road. And the consultant said, great, what do you want us to do? And they said, I don't know, you're the consultant, you figure it out. So they looked around and said, hey, you know, here is a rating system that provides us a menu of things that we can do. Now we can go back and talk to that city and say, look, if you want to be sustainable, here's the menu of things you can do. Here's what we think applies best to your project. And actually that particular early effort in the planning stages was a number of years ago, and that road actually was just certified this month. So they've actually carried it all the way through, and it really helped make some sense about what sustainability was and how it shows up on your project. In other words, what can I do to make my project more sustainable today? And then if you want an example of some successes, I think that's one of the examples. And we've seen other examples with, and I always kind of talk from a rating system perspective, but we've seen other examples where they've looked at that menu of options of sustainability and actually ended up saving a lot of money. I think the city of San Jose a few years ago was looking at a rehabilitation project, and from looking at the options of sustainability, as you might see in this guidebook or in a rating system, they ended up opening themselves up to considering cold-in-place recycling instead of a complete remove and replace. And by their calculations, that saved them a big chunk of money. And so they had a project that's, I think, estimated at something like $6 million. And I think their bids all came in once they opened it up to cold-in-place recycling at something like 2.7 to 3. And so they were very happy with being able to be provided a menu from which they could kind of pick or think about these options. Of course, you still have to apply common sense and engineering judgment as to which ones are appropriate or not.
Excellent. Looking at our time, and I think we definitely have time for at least one more, and I'll go to Joop with this one. And it has to do with allocation. And basically, what happens often, it seems what you were saying, Joop, with the creation of PCRs, you know, they're often industry-driven. How do you balance allocation between very different industries? In other words, you know, if we're all staying within the pavement realm, at least there might be some mechanism to make sure that the allocation is consistent. But how about when you're moving from something like the steel industry or the electrical power generation industry and then the transportation industry?
Yeah. No, it's a really good question, Tom. It really reflects the level of standardization and the efforts that we put into getting to a common set of rules. And so it doesn't just apply to allocation, but allocation is always a good point to talk about. And one way of first scoping how important it is always to say, well, we're looking at a specific rule in conducting an LCA. Well, what's actually the impact on the LCA? So let's frame it right. And if it's not important, then in a way it doesn't really matter how you make the rules, and it can actually be a little bit different here and there because they're not going to impact the results anyway. From allocation, we know that typically it tends to be relevant, and so well, how do you then make sure that everybody's using the same rules like you asked? Well, there are several mechanisms that ISO around LCA prescribes that we can use to, if we all follow those properly, we should not end up in a situation where it's different, but history has proven us wrong. But some of those mechanisms are that ISO has rules on how allocation should be done. When you get to environmental product declaration, there are requirements for developing the product category rule, and one of them is look around you and see what is already written up for the industry for specific materials, and use what has already been discussed by other people. You can only deviate if you have a good reason for it. And it actually says, well, if you want to do it differently, you should join the committee that's actually governing the existing PCR and see if you can make it better. And so there are all kinds of incentives to prevent that we get into the situations, but we still do. And so what we hope from the framework is that at least within the pavement industry and the framework development that we're doing for the LCA, and we're hopefully publishing in September, that some of these conversations within the industry are being illuminated, and that when people develop PCR in the industry, that they take notice. You gave an example of electricity producing fly ash that's being used as an SEM in concrete, or blast furnace slag from the steel industry. Those are typically industries that are not part necessarily of the pavement industry. How do you align that? Well, the stakes and questions just get higher and more difficult. That said, since those materials and products are being used by other industries as well, there is experience from using those materials in other sectors as well. Concrete is not only used in pavement, as we're all aware of. And so a lot of these conversations have been had. It's important to understand that whenever you do develop a PCR, you should take into account what has happened before, and you should make sure that your stakeholder representation is actually up to what needs to be discussed. And sometimes, in the end, you could conclude, well, we should have invited that industry because whatever we do in that industry influences our results. Now, in a couple of years going forward, hopefully we'll see that the rules in defining a PCR in America is going to be more aligned. I'm not sure whether we'll get to standard anytime soon, but it comes down to looking around, listening, and holding each other accountable. This is a voluntary market, and a voluntary market means that we just have to talk to each other to make sure that we don't fall in these traps and that we make applying LCA as least biased as possible.
Well, thanks, Joop. I think we're just about out of time. So, Kurt, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
All right, thank you, Tom, and certainly we want to express our appreciation to all of our presenters today, as well as to all the attendees. We certainly appreciate you taking time out of your schedule to join us. On the screen, you'll see the listing of future webinars, so we hope you can fit these into your schedule. The next one is scheduled for May 19th, and it will be focusing solely on asphalt pavements. starting with materials, design, and construction. So promises to be a very interesting and informative webinar. We will be issuing, as I mentioned, PDH certificates to those people that registered. So in the next several weeks, we'll begin processing those, and we'll send those out electronically to the email address that each registrant provided when they registered. And with that, I guess I will thank everyone once again, and we hope to see everyone in a future webinar. So thank you very much.